everyone, and thank you for signing up for this TÜV webinar on Sustainable Sourcing of Wood and Paper, FSC and PEFC certification at a glance. I will be your moderator today, and I will go through some basic information before we kick off with the presentation. So before we start, just a quick introduction of the speaker today. We have with us Mr. Sebastian Hetsch, who is Product Compliance Manager for FSC certification. Sebastian is the lead auditor for both FSC and PEFC chain of custody certification. He has been with TÜV since 2008 and focuses on the certification of wood and paper supply chains as well as climate change projects. So with that, I will now hand the presentation over to Sebastian, who will kick off with an introduction on the market overview. Over to you, Sebastian.
Yeah, good day, everyone. Very nice to see that there are quite a lot of people interested in that topic. So as you can see here, I have prepared a presentation and an overview on this topic of forest certification. So just to give you a summary what we are going to discuss today, I will start with a first short overview on what is forest certification for those of you who might not be so familiar with these topics. Then I will give a short market overview on FSC and PEFC certification. And then actually the main part of the presentation is really looking into this FSC standard. And then have a short look in the PEFC standard, and last but not least, looking into the EU timber regulation. So as I've seen from the companies that I've signed up, I assume that quite some of you had been dealing with this regulation, so perhaps there might also be more questions on that. So I'm very happy to get back to your questions at the end of the session. And as it was mentioned in the introduction, please just type them in the chat. So I hope that's more or less what you expected. We're gonna start here now. So forest certification, what is that actually? Not going very far back, but basically it was introduced in the 1990s as a tool to promote sustainable forest management with the final aim to protect forests worldwide. So basically all forest certification schemes have two different scopes. One is on the forest management, so that means certification of the forests. This is environmental and social and economic criteria for the management of certain forest areas. So that means, for example, to ensure that people working in the forest have proper protection gear, that some important ecological areas are protected, and so on. So this is the first part. The second part is actually the certification of the supply chain, which is called chain of custody, and that shall ensure the traceability of the raw material, so that only eligible material, meaning mainly from certified forests, is included in a product that in the end carries the logo. So the aim of the certification is really that the end consumer shall be able to tell by a logo on a product if this material or that this material is actually sourced from responsibly managed forests. It might actually be easier to understand if we look into this little picture here. That's the same what I discussed before. So the first part is the forest management certification, what you see on the left side. And then the supply chain certification, where it's really about traceability, so that the final end consumer, when he goes to the retailer market, he can actually be sure that his product really comes from a sustainably managed forest. So that's the basic idea of this forest certification. Worldwide, there are two major, or I would say leading certification systems. One is this Forest Stewardship Council, that's this FSC, and you see this little tree with these three letters here, which is the main logo of this standard. And there is a second one called Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification, that's PEFC. And that's this logo you can see on the right lower part of this slide. So what's the difference? Basically, the intention of the two standards is similar. Both want to promote sustainable forest management worldwide. Also, both standards are voluntary and they are competing on the market. FSC has the main advantage that it's actually supported by major environmental and social organizations like WWF, which is a World Wildlife Fund, or woodworking unions, etc. While PEFC is mainly supported from wood industry and forest owners. The main difference in the two standards or in the two schemes are really in the forest management standards. So when looking into the chain of custody, so this is the standards that most of you would be dealing with, I assume, then the requirements of these two standards are actually quite similar. And today we are actually mainly looking into the chain of custody standards, so we're not looking at the forest management certification, so really we're focusing on this chain of custody certification system. But before that, we have a look at the markets of these two schemes, just so that you have a rough idea. Forest certification worldwide, for FSC, about 200 million hectares are certified. I actually don't have the exact figure, but I think that's around 5% of the world's forests. And for PEFC, there are more, around 313 million hectares certified. On the opposite, the certified companies in the chain of custody, there you find much more certified according to FSC. That's around 34,000, and for PEFC around 20,000. And that already gives you an indication that actually for products that are certified, there are more products certified according to FSC, and the demand from companies related to FSC is higher on a worldwide level compared to PEFC. There is a slight difference depending on the area or the region of the world. In general, the certification mainly focuses on the Western countries like Europe and North America. So here in this graph, you actually see the distribution for FSC certifications for the chain of custody, but that already gives you an indication what kind of products are being bought. So you can see this green part, this is Europe, so there are most companies certified according to FSC chain of custody, and then 1/4 is in Asia. By far leading is China, where there's a lot of production, as you obviously know. And then this light blue is actually North America. So the distribution for PEFC certification is quite similar, focusing even a bit more on North America and much less on Asia. Focusing more on Europe. And another interesting fact that might be relevant for you also is looking at why certificate holders, so meaning companies, actually get certified. So the major reason for companies to get certified is really the demand from their client. So often there are big retailers that sell products to the end user that want to ensure that they can tell their clients, meaning the end consumer, that the product comes from responsibly managed forests. So if they decide that all our products shall be certified, then obviously the entire supply chain has to get certified, and that is the major reason for companies to get certified. Nevertheless, as you can see here, around 49% also say that it's a competitive advantage. So that companies say, okay, if we are certified, that gives us the possibility to export, for example, to certain European or North American countries. That's kind of connected to the 30% improved market access. And also the fourth reason is that companies say we get certified in order to be in line with our corporate social responsibility strategy. So these are really the main reasons. Most of them get certified because of demand from their clients, but on the other hand, competitive advantage to improve market access and ensure compliance with their corporate social responsibility strategy. And this is another figure that gives a similar impression that asks actually, do you agree? And most companies do agree that FSC certification helps to create a positive corporate image, and the label adds value to the product. So these figures that I presented here are actually, as you can see on the top, from the FSC Global Market Survey from 2016, so that was published last year, but they are still quite valid, and basically the same applies to PEFC certifications. However, as mentioned before, FSC has a bit stronger value addition to the products because they are promoted by big environmental companies in particular. So as I mentioned before, WWF is there. So this is, of course, a strong reason for companies to choose FSC if they say, okay, we want to get certified in order to create a positive corporate image and to add value to our product. So this was just a very rough overview that you see, okay, where is FSC and PEFC certification, how many companies are certified, and what are reasons for companies to get certified. I assume that most of you are currently not certified, so what I thought I would include here is a short overview on what are requirements for this chain of custody standards of FSC and PEFC. So I'm going through that. Of course, this is only an introduction, and once you would decide to actually get certified, you would have to deal more with that, but I hope that it gives you an impression on what are the requirements if you wanted to get certified. So what is quite important, this is for FSC, but actually the same applies also for the PEFC certification, which companies are actually required to get certified under the chain of custody standards. So as you've also seen in the beginning, the chain of custody certification is required for each stage of the supply chain. So that means if a company wants to pass on an FSC claim of a product. So that means any processing company, so FSC calls it primary or secondary processing, meaning if you're in the wood sector, it would be a sawmill, that would be primary processing, and then secondary processing, perhaps a furniture manufacturer, etc. And then, of course, also the companies that apply the logo on a product, including printers, they have to get certified. But also companies trading and distributing, in particular, unfinished and unlabeled products. So these companies really have to get certified if they want to sell any FSC products. So as a rule of thumb, in general, each stage of the supply chain that involves a change of product ownership has to get certified. So it means it's mainly for business to business where the certification matters. So on the other side, which companies are exempt from certification? That's mainly retailers selling to end users. So if there's a final product that's already labeled and there will not be any further change of the product, then you don't need to get certified. There are also certain benefits to still get certified, in particular for marketing purposes or for ensuring that information is correct, but it's not a requirement. So further other companies that are not required to get certified are companies that do not take legal ownership of the product. So if they only are in the possession of the product, but if they do not have the ownership. So that includes agents in auction houses, logistic companies or transporting companies or companies who are just storing, and so-called contractors operating under an outsourcing agreement. So if they just do some work for the companies without being the actual owner of the material. But I think this is quite important for you to know, as I said, in particular, if you're not yet certified, to really think about whether you would need to get certified or not. So this is really one key step before starting. So if you figured out that your company has to get certified, then actually there are the following requirements. FSC, unfortunately, is set up in a little bit complex way, so to say, because there's not one standard, but the FSC decided to put their requirements in 5 different standards. So depending on what you're intending to do, you would have to get these different documents. The standard with this abbreviation FSC STD 4004, that's a basic standard. So that's just what I want to introduce today. Then there's one standard on the logo use, one for multi-site, one for reclaimed, and one for controlled wood. I'm going to touch upon this very briefly. All standards are available on the website of FSC International. So I included the link here, and I think you will get the presentation also afterwards, so you could copy the link if you are interested in these standards. And then you actually need this small numbers in order to find them. So basically, this is just an overview. As I said, we're going to discuss this basic standard today. And I like to work with this little picture that we at TÜV created that is kind of a short overview or telling the story of the supply chain of timber. And the standard for this chain of custody is actually the requirements are along this supply chain. So you can see on the left side where this blue line starts, there's requirements related to material sourcing and timber legality. Then once the timber arrives in your company, there's requirements related to material receipt and storage. Then it goes on in your company. There's quality management, some requirements. There's volume control, and then going further down, there are requirements related to the claims and labels and sales and delivery, and also if you have any outsources. So the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going through these different points here, using that picture so that you can see where you are and hopefully giving you an idea of what these requirements are. If you have any detailed questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll come back to them later. As I said, the intention is to give you an overview so that you know what are actually requirements that you have to deal with if you want to implement this. And again, this is about FSC, but basically the concept of PEFC is more or less the same. So just keep that in mind. So when starting actually with that standard, but also with the requirements, some core requirements are related to the management system. In case you are certified according to ISO 9001, you might be quite familiar with that. So that's a ISO quality management standard. So you have to have documented procedures. You have to appoint responsible personnel. You have to do trainings. Record keeping and archiving is important. There has to be a complaint procedure, and also there are some requirements related to occupational health and safety. So these are some concepts of quality management that are also included in the FSC standard, and the same actually applies for PEFC. So you must have that, and basically that's usually the start that you somewhere have documented procedures on to explain how your control system of this chain of custody works. Then coming to the actual requirements, one of the key, which might be obvious, is looking at material sourcing. So the main activities here, and that's perhaps not surprising, that you have to check your suppliers. So you have to do the supplier validation to check if they have actually a FSC certification, a valid certificate. So there's actually an FSC database where you can see all these certified companies. And also once they send you some material, you have to check the incoming sales and delivery documentation to check if the product really carries an FSC claim. Because simply the fact that the company is certified does not mean that they sell certified products. So this is quite important to know. It's not enough to check if they have a valid certificate, but you must check if they really sold you FSC or PEFC material. And that must be stated on this invoice. So this is a major difference also to the ISO standards, in case you're familiar with that it's not enough to check the certificate like with ISO, but it has to be clearly stated on sales or delivery documentation that this is actually certified material. And connected to that, in case it's not certified, or even if it is certified, you have to ensure that you comply with timber legality requirements. So in the Europe, or if you're exporting to Europe, this is in particular this EU timber regulation, this EUTR. I'll discuss it a bit later. And the same applies for the US with the US Lacey Act, or Japan or Australia that have similar legislation. So, and again, I'm coming back to that, FSC already includes the core requirements of this timber legislation in their standard also. The next point is actually in the standard. So once you checked your suppliers, then you have to look at the material handling. So once the material gets to your company premises, then you have to ensure that there is adequate segregation. In particular, if you have some FSC production and some non-FSC production. So you have to describe if you keep this material physically separated, or if there's a temporal separation, or if you identify the material or whatever. Then the next requirements are actually related to material and product records. So that basically means that on the second point here, this material balance, you have to document and summarize FSC input and output material. And obviously that leads to this first point here with the conversion factor that depending on your production process, you lose a certain amount of material. So for example, a sawmill, if they buy 100 cubic meters of around wood, then afterwards they probably only sell, 70% lumber, meaning the sawn wood. So that would be the conversion factor, then this 70%. And that has to be documented. Also, this is more related to our documentation. You have to define the product groups, meaning what is actually included in your certificate. So for example, round wood, or this oriented strand board, OSB, or table, or pulp, or books. So this defines really the scope of your certificate in terms of products. And then there are different systems for controlling this chain of custody. That's called the transfer system, percentage system, or credit system. So these are actually three different methods to track the material that you buy and sell. So the most common is actually the first one, this transfer system, where you simply sell the products that you have bought with the same FSC information, with the same FSC claim. Then there's the option to have a percentage system, so that allows you to mix different FSC material. So there's some material that's called FSC 100% that comes from 100% certified forests. And then there's some material called FSC controlled wood, which only assures that the minimum legal requirements are met, but this is not certified. And if you want to mix these two, you can end up with FSC, for example, 70%. So this is in particular relevant for production companies. If you're just a trader, then actually this percentage system is not useful for you. And there's also this so-called FSC recycled material. So that is referring to recycled paper or reclaimed wood. So that's also an option. So these three so-called claims that you see here are something that you can actually use in particular in this percentage system. And the credit system, which is the last one that's kind of similar to the percentage system, here actually these FSC claims are booked in a, so to say, virtual credit account. So if you buy, for example, 100 tons of FSC 100%, then you get this 100 tons as a credit. And if you buy FSC controlled wood, then you can also use it, but you do not get any credits because it's not certified. But then you can sell either of that with the respective credits that you have included. If you're not familiar with these three systems, that might be a bit much in short time. So in case you had questions, we can get back to them later. Otherwise, I would suggest to look in the standards to see the details. The message I wanted to get across here is really that there are three different systems and you will stumble across them. So hopefully you had a rough idea of what to use. And as I said, for most companies, they actually just use a simple transfer system. Okay, so the next step is actually, so this was mainly related to the production. So obviously mainly relevant for companies that are producing. The next requirement here again is relevant for most companies. That's related to labeling. And here there's a bridge between this basic standard and this logo standard 5001. And I'll discuss about that in a minute. But basically the requirements are that you have to follow the rather strict requirements for the FSC label use. And also when it comes to sales of FSC material, you have to make sure that you put the correct information on sales and delivery documentation. So as I mentioned before, depending on what kind of FSC products you have, you can have, for example, FSC 100% or FSC mixed credit or FSC recycled 100% or FSC controlled wood. So these are some of the rather common FSC claims. And if you remember, so this FSC mixed credit, that comes from a company that produced in the credit system. That's very common in the paper sector. If you have recycled 100%, that may come from a company that uses recycled paper or reclaimed wood using a percentage system. And the FSC controlled wood can be wood or timber that is not certified but only was checked for timber legality. And if you are selling your FSC product, to come back to the requirement, you have to ensure that you include this correct FSC claim on sales and delivery documentation. So that's related to what I said in the beginning. It's not enough to have a valid certificate, but you must ensure that you actually include this FSC information on sales and delivery documentation. Because any certified company is also allowed to sell non-certified products, although they have a valid FSC certificate, and only you can see if this is a FSC certified product if it is on sales and delivery documentation. So therefore, this is extremely crucial. And then the, I think, last part is actually related to outsourcing. So this basically is an option for you if you have a company that is doing some services for you. You can include them in the scope of your certificate. So you're contracting an internal business process to another company. Important is that you, as a certificate holder, remain the owner of the material during the outsource process. And you can actually find the preconditions and requirements for outsourcing here in this standard. It's basically that you have to sign a contract with them, and depending on the so-called risk in terms of FSC mixing, there has to be an audit from the company from the certification company also at this outsourcing company or not. So in some cases, for example, if you outsource only storage activities to another company, usually no audit is required there. If you do outsource some more complex, for example, processing activities, then it's more likely that an audit would have to be carried out at this company as well. So that actually was supposed to give you a very brief overview on what this FSC chain of custody basic standard really is about. So we are really looking at what you see in this little picture at this supply chain. So it's basically no rocket science. There's no super complex requirements. Of course, the devil always lies in the details. But the main part is really to ensure that your material is sourced from certified suppliers, that the invoices of the suppliers are filled correctly. And then a major part is also the quality management, that you document all the information correctly. And the last part, that you ensure that labeling and sales is done correctly. Good. There was a question in the meantime. I'll come back to the question actually in the end, if you don't mind, because perhaps some of the points are also answered later in my presentation. Yeah, so as I said, these were the basic requirements. There are these other standards, and I'm going to touch upon them briefly. So this 4001 is a standard for logo use. And basically, FSC has registered their trademarks in most countries. And they have different trademarks that are registered. The first ones are the simple three initials, the letters FSC. That's a registered trademark. In for example, Europe and most Asian countries also, etc. Also, the name Forest Stewardship Council is registered. And also these different little pictures that you see here. So this picture with a tree and check mark, and also these pictures with Forest for All Forever. This was only introduced about 1.5 years ago, I think. And there is a standard that defines on how you can use these different pictures here. And that is, of course, very relevant, in particular, if you want to apply them to your product. So that means that you, if you are a certificate holder, meaning certified, you must sign a contract with FSC, the so-called trademark license agreement, where you agree to, basically using the trademark correctly. And what is important, if an FSC logo shall be used, for example, on a product, the certificate holder must submit the design, so that's the artwork, of this product to his certification body for approval. So this is quite special for FSC. That means in particular for printers, that's quite important. If you are printing a, say, book that has this FSC logo on it, then it first has to be approved by the certification body. Or actually, since about 1 year, there's also the option that you as a company can have your own system for trademark approval. And these trademarks, you can actually see them here on the slide. They are a bit different depending on the product. So there's one label, FSC Mix. So this is in case it's not 100% FSC, but in case there's a mix of FSC 100% and controlled wood, or FSC 100% and recycled, then you end up with this mixed logo. Then there's the option to have FSC 100%, so that's mainly used for wood products, so for example furniture, where you're really sure, so this is 100% from a certified forest. And then you have this logo for recycled, which basically says that it's from recycled paper or reclaimed wood. So depending on the product that you're labeling, you will actually use one of these products. And this is described in the standard 5001. And as I said, what is quite important is to ensure that this is in line with the requirements and then approved by the certification body. So that's just quite brief on this logo standard. I see that there are 2 questions. As I said, I'll get back to them. But just for the time purpose, that's really the key message for this FSC logo use. Then there are 3 different standards. I'm not going into them, just mentioning them briefly. So one standard is actually this 4003 for multi-site. So that means if you have several sites under one certificate, it's an own standard, but actually the requirements are not so complicated. It's basically saying you have to do internal audits at the sites. You have to do a management review and training at the different sites. So, but the key is really the internal audits here. And the second point is if you want to apply that, or if you are already applying that, you have to check if your company is eligible for a multi-site. So the requirement is that there has to be so-called common ownership, and that's clearly defined in FSC that you need to have the mother company, so to say, must hold at least 51%. If that's not the case, there's also some options related to signing a contractual agreement, but there are also some requirements to that. But in case you want to apply multi-site, then ensure to first check if the eligibility criteria are met. This next standard, 4007, is related to reclaimed material. So there it's quite important. This is only in case you want to use non-certified recycled paper or recycled reclaimed wood. So if you are, for example, buying material that already carries an FSC recycled claim, it's not required. So basically this is only for, say, for example, paper companies that use recycled paper, or for companies producing wooden boards like MDF or OSB that use reclaimed wood that is not certified. So overall, there are not so many companies using that. And the very last part, and I'll talk about that briefly here, is actually the so-called controlled wood standard. And if you are certified and working with that, you might have realized that in the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a lot of updates here and changes because this controlled wood standard is really focusing on non-certified wood. So if you as a company want to buy non-certified wood, then you have to apply the standard here, 4005 for FSC controlled wood. And that is, so to say, the standard of FSC to ensure compliance with relevant timber regulations as the EUTR, but also the Lacey Act in the US. So the reason that it was changed over the last 2 or 3 years was mainly to ensure compliance with EUTR, which came into effective 2013. So again, this is of course a quite complex topic, and we could have several webinars only on that. So I'll give a short overview on what it does here, and perhaps you have some more detailed questions also. So this standard of FSC is required if a company wants to include non-certified material to a product that they intend to sell as an FSC mixed product. So remember earlier I said that if you're a company that want to mix wood from 100% certified forests together with wood that is only checked according to legality requirements, then this wood has to be certified or checked against this 4005 standard, and you can mix it. So the input material must comply at minimum with these requirements defined in the standard. Input materials that was assessed according to this standard can then be considered controlled material and claimed as controlled wood. So it's not certified, it's only controlled. And the core piece of this standard is actually more or less, I would nearly say, not quite a copy-paste, but quite closely related to the EU timber regulation, and it's a so-called due diligence system. So the abbreviation is DDS, and this is quite, as I said, the wording comes from the EU timber regulation, basically. And this due diligence system basically means that the company has to assess the risk if material comes from so-called unacceptable sources. So unacceptable sources are defined, but it mainly means illegally harvested wood, or there are in total there are 5 categories of unacceptable sources, including wood. Legality is one issue, then social topics like child labor, conflict timber, etc., ecological points that this is not from highly valuable ecosystems, and that this wood does not come from destruction of forests, like deforestation activities, and also not from genetically modified organisms. So these are the 5 different categories. So the standard basically, as I mentioned, was designed to demonstrate compliance with the EU timber regulation or Lacey Act and others. However, what is important that it's not a compliance audit. So if you are FSC certified, this is usually accepted by companies looking into that, by organizations or who are ensuring compliance for that. But it's not a compliance audit as such. Yeah, so that's a very brief on this FSC standards, as I said. And on the last point, I'll discuss about that a bit later. Looking at the PEFC standard, in general, as I mentioned in the beginning, the concept is very much the same. The setup of the document I find much easier to handle because it's basically one document that includes all the different requirements. So the basic standard of FSC already includes issues related to due diligence system timber legislation. So this is the same as in this FSC controlled wood standard. And also multi-site requirements are included in the Appendix 2, so there's no extra requirements. And also requirements related to reclaimed material, recycled material are included here. So the only thing that is extra is also a standard for the logo use. So in summary, the requirements for PEFC chain of custody are more or less similar, if not the same, as FSC chain of custody. So the core requirements include quality management systems. So that's more or less similar to FSC. There are some more quality management aspects included, like a management review and internal audits that are not required by FSC. Then also here you have to check the suppliers of incoming material. And here it's important to note that PEFC does not recognize FSC. So you have to check obviously for PEFC valid certificates and to ensure that on sales and delivery documentation there are PEFC claims on there. And when you sell your material, obviously you also have to check that the PEFC material is correctly stated so that you have adequate claims on your sales documentation. And also correct use of PEFC logos, which are slightly different. But so summarizing, the requirements that I just mentioned for FSC apply quite similar to PEFC as well. As I said, there's a logo standard. I've shown you the logo in the beginning, so that's a bit more relaxed. The requirements. Both standards actually have a toolkit for producing or generating the label. So once you are certified, you actually get access in FSC, it's an internet portal where you can download your company logos then with your certification number. And in PEFC, in most countries, they work with a software that they send to your company that you can install to generate your logos. But overall, the requirements of the PEFC on the logo use is more relaxed than FSC, who is very strict on ensuring really compliance with their standard. So for PEFC, it's important to know that the two standards, FSC and PEFC, do not recognize each other. So FSC material is not accepted as certified material in PEFC products and vice versa. So as I mentioned, PEFC requirements include internal audits and management reviews. So that's for the chain of custody, one of the main differences, I would say. And also, as mentioned before, the basic standards includes already this requirements related to this due diligence system. So for timber legislation, there's no extra standard needed. Also, the multiple site standard is included in PEFC, and there's no extra standard for reclaimed or recycled material. So the main difference are really in the forest management standards of the two certification schemes. So this is something that we have not discussed, but just to keep in mind that really the differences is not really in the chain of custody standards, but in the forest management standards. So the last part is actually looking into the timber regulation, and in particular the EU timber regulation related to these two standards. So the EU timber regulation, or EUTR, as you might know, came into effect in March 2013 with the aim to prevent sale of illegal timber and timber products into the European Union. So now any actor who imports timber, that means wood and paper, or timber products to the EU must ensure that the timber was legally harvested and exported legally from the country of harvest. And this timber regulation at EU level is actually broken down into national law in every member state now. So, and also, it's not only in the EU, but as mentioned before, also in the US and Japan or Australia, you have similar legislation. So that means this regulation also affects companies outside the EU, as their products may be imported into the EU further down the supply chain. And it covers a broad range of timber products, including solid wood, flooring, plywood, pulp, and paper. And basically, it depends on the code for the custom, whether your product is included in the EUTR or not. So there are some rather strange exemptions that some type of chairs are not included, although they are made of wood, or paper that is printed is not included. But if it's paper that is unprinted, it would be included here. So you have to carefully look on whether your product that you are importing actually is included into the EUTR or not. And the core requirements is that, obviously the aim is to prevent import of illegally harvested timber. And it's defined a bit more what companies have to do. So companies that are that have to apply this EUTR, they must implement a so-called due diligence system. So as I said before, this word was also included in the two standards, FSC and PEFC. And in the timber regulation, it says that this due diligence system has actually 3 elements to minimize the risk that your wood products or paper products come from illegally harvested sources. And these 3 steps is something that every company in the EU importing timber has to do. So the first one is information. meaning that companies must have access to information related to their wood and wood products. So a country of harvest, species, and details of the supplier. Secondly, there must be a risk assessment. So that means the company must assess a risk if the timber was illegally harvested, and if there is identified a potential risk, there must be a risk mitigation for this. So this sounds pretty complex, and actually it is. So the easiest for companies is either to just buy timber that is from the EU, or to do some risk mitigation options, and certification like FSC or PEFC is a potential risk mitigation option. So as I said, it's not a compliance certification with the requirement, but it's an option to mitigate your risk. And this is also accepted in most European countries by the authorities who are in charge of this regulation. So both FSC and PEFC try to ensure that all components of the certification are aligned with the EUTR. Therefore, these tools can be used to demonstrate compliance. And if you're interested in that, both FSC and PEFC have actually published some documents that explain that more in details. So I've included the links in here. However, just important to mention that again, that PEFC and FSC does not result in exemption from the due diligence system, but it's basically used as a tool to mitigate the risk. So that's really the key message. Having said that, it already brings me to the end of this short overview. As I said, since we only have about an hour, I hope that was helpful for you to get an understanding on what certification is, to get a brief idea on what the two standards are and how they interact with the EU timber regulation.
Thank you, Sebastian, for sharing your insights, and thank you everyone for your attention. That's all the questions that we have today, and we've also almost run out of time. So we hope you found this session really interesting and relevant. We run several similar webinars on this topic of environmental and sustainability. So we hope that you'll sign up for our mailing list. So you can find that at www.tufsuit.com/CPS, where you will receive the latest news and any regulatory updates, and also invitations to future webinars like this. So if you have any questions regarding the webinar topic or what we do, just feel free to email us and we'll put you in touch with the expert. So once again, thank you, Sebastian, and thank you everyone for your time, and have a good rest of the day ahead.
Follow up. So thanks also very much from my side, and have a nice day.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.